Be seated. There are many stories in the Bible from which we can learn a lot. We can learn from them that God is on our side, and He has always been about calling people who will be holy. He is calling people who will live in this world but not necessarily be of this world. When we hear the call of God in our lives and live according to His will, our whole life will make sense. And one of those Bible stories, which is also one of my favorite ones, is the story of Joseph. We can find it in Genesis chapters 37 to 50. And I would like to go through his life and focus on his faithfulness to God. Faithfulness. We all have to deal with it in our lives. If you are married, you promise to be faithful. If you have a job, you should and need to be faithful to show up and work as promised. If you have a loan or borrow money from someone, you are bound by a contract to be faithful in paying it back. I think Joseph sets the bar quite high and is a huge example of faithfulness in all circumstances of his life. Let's look at his life where we can find and learn principles of faithful living. I would like to share 8 points with you. The Bible says that Joseph was about 17 when we hear about him. He was the youngest of a large and quite diverse family. He had half brothers and half sisters. We learn that Joseph is Jacob's favorite son, and Jacob gives him a special coat of many colors, and that kind of sets him apart from the others in the family. Joseph loved his father, but he had a little habit of reporting to his father all the things his half-brothers were doing wrong. The Bible says that his brothers were so upset with him that they couldn't say a kind word about him. And that brings us to the first point. Telling the truth is always important, but sometimes it might be better not to say anything. I am not suggesting that we should lie or not to be truthful, not at all, but we should always be kind. Telling the truth was not Joseph's problem. His problem was knowing when to talk and how much to say. It is almost like he couldn't restrain himself. It is a little like for a man having a girlfriend or wife, and she asks him if she looks fat in a certain dress. What does he say? She might already know she looks fat. So if he fibs and tells her that she looks slim, she knows he's not telling the truth. And if he tells her the truth, well, she will be upset and might even cry. It is almost certain that no matter what he says, he can't win. Sometimes it's just better to say nothing. There are some things that Joseph should have kept to himself. Let's read Genesis 37, verses 5 to 9. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." This story takes a terrible turn at this point. His brothers are planning to kill him because they can't stand his tattletale, and added to that, now he has started with his prediction of greatness. Point number 2. No matter how bad it looks on the outside, God is always with those who are faithful. We are now in Egypt, where Joseph was sold by his brothers. He is now far away from his home in a strange land, and he ends up in Potiphar's hands. Throughout the whole story, we find a verse that is often repeated. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. In fact, Potiphar was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. Notice that Joseph was blessed by God and appointed him to be in charge of his household. Today, we might say that he was a chief of staff. Verse 5 of chapter 39 says that from the day Joseph was put in charge, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. How often do we look at our circumstances or work situation and think negative thoughts? But then we read this and it leaves us with the strong suggestion that God may bless the people we work for and with because of our connection to Him. The stronger our connection and relationship to God, the bigger is the blessing on those around us. We should never forget that God is with those who are faithful, no matter what is happening around them. For Joseph, things were about to become challenging. And the third point I would like to make is that having integrity matters all the time. Verse 7 of chapter 39 says that Potiphar's wife began to notice Joseph, and his reaction is recorded in chapter 39, verses 8 to 9. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? We also have our ups and downs in life. Sometimes the downs are not even our fault or our doing. Joseph is a great example of doing the right thing in a place where he certainly could have given to the temptation. He was a long way from home with no one to be accountable to, and yet he was firm in his convictions about what was right and wrong. While trying to escape Potiphar's wife's touch, he left his coat in her hands. Because she is angry at being rejected, she tells her and her husband that Joseph tried to rape her. He obviously doesn't like what he hears and sends him to prison. Let's read Genesis 39:21 to 23. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Integrity matters all the time. Be faithful to God and the principle of godly living that He is asking of you. Be faithful when everybody is looking, and be faithful when no one is looking, because what you are in secret and what you do when no one is looking is what you are. As C.S. Lewis said, integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Joseph stays in prison for quite a few years, and with God's help, he interprets some dreams for two other prisoners. Many years later, one of them is employed by Pharaoh, and he remembers Joseph and his God-given ability to understand people's dreams and tells Pharaoh about him. Joseph is brought before Pharaoh to interpret his dreams. And we have now moved to the chapter 41 and to our fourth point, which is knowing that God is the source of our success. Genesis 41:16 says, I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Faithfulness is important. However, we need to be aware that when God blesses us because of our faithfulness, we should always remember where the blessings come from. During the days when Muhammad Ali was a great boxer, he would go around in his arrogance and say that he was the greatest. Humility was never his strong suit. One day, back in his prime, he was on a plane that was ready to take off. The flight attendant had repeatedly told him to put on his seatbelt. He finally told her, I'm a Superman, and Superman doesn't need no seatbelt. The flight attendant didn't hesitate a minute, but shot back with, Superman don't need no plane either, now buckle up. It is very important that we live with the sense and acknowledgement of God on a daily basis, because we need Him. For Joseph, it meant, once again, being pressed into service and being used by God. And that leads us to the point number 5. Faithfulness to God will open doors you and I can't imagine. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams and listen to his response. Genesis 41:38. So Pharaoh asked them, Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? The Pharaoh goes as far as appointing Joseph to be the second in command in Egypt and to be in charge of the entire land. This wasn't anything small. He was given the chariot reserved for the second in command, and wherever he went, the command, "Kneel down," was shouted. Living in the center of God's will take you places you could never imagine on your own. When we are faithful, God will open doors beyond our imagination. In fact, in Ephesians 3:20, we are reminded that God will do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. To follow God's will, or even being faithful, may be at some cost, but we have heaven to gain, and that is why it's worthy. Point number 6, you can be faithful anywhere. Joseph is in a strange land with no relatives. He only has God. Pharaoh gives him a wife who bears him sons, and he gives them these names. We read about it in chapter 41, verses 51 to 52. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Notice that Joseph is not bitter or angry. He has accepted his life as God has ordered it. He feels blessed, yet in touch with his grief. He is grateful, but still aware that he is without his family and far away. Joseph allows these life circumstances to make him better and not bitter. He lets God use him whenever he is. There are many of us here today who left their homelands or hometowns and moved somewhere else. I know from my own experience that it hasn't always been easy, and as one could say, walk in the park. But I know that God has led my life. I can see it when I look back. I have made some mistakes and maybe made some choices that were not the best, but God has seen me through them. Pharaoh has a dream, and God interprets it through Joseph. Famine was to come after 7 years of plenty, and Joseph is in a position to lead the nation of Egypt as they plan and prepare for it. When the famine comes, it has an effect on the surrounding countries too. Joseph's family decides to go to Egypt and ask for food. They have no idea that the man in command is the very annoying brother that they sold in slavery many years ago. Let me just pick a few things from the next chapters. When his brothers stand before him and are on their knees, he remembers the dreams he had years ago. He puts them through a series of tests to see if they have changed or if they are still the same jealous man. We can read that more than once he breaks down and cries. He has been faithful, and now God has brought him back full circle. He has the lives of his brothers in his hands. In chapter 45, we read that Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loud that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. You and I are given one chance to live in this world. When people come to the end of their lives, they ask all sorts of questions. Did I live a good life? Did I do the right thing when it was needed? Was I a good example and influence on my children and people around me? Have I been faithful? And I think we should find time to ask ourselves the question, have I been faithful before we come to the end of our lives, and not to live with regrets at where we put our priorities. Point number 7. Recognize God's plan for your life, even when it is not what you have imagined. Genesis 45, verses 5 to 8. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for sending me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Can you see God's plan unfolding in your life? Are there plans that don't seem to make sense on the surface, and yet you believe that God is in them? Are you ready to step out in faith and let God lead you no matter what? And the last point I would like to make is that God's will is always better than our best made plans. In Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He'd brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." If you are living a faithful life and doing what God asks of you to do, then there is a better plan that is working in your life that is bigger and better than any plan you could have had for yourself. Author Gary Thomas, founder of the Center of Evangelical Spirituality, writes in Discipleship Journal, "When my wife and I prayed extensively about buying a house, we gave God many opportunities to close the door. God appeared to bless the move. 5 years later, our house is worth considerably less than what we paid for it. Why didn't God stop us? My wife and I kept wondering. After all, we had given him plenty of opportunities. But one day, as my wife was praying, she sensed God asking her, 'Have you ever considered the possibility that I wanted you in that neighborhood to minister there rather than bolster your financial equity?' There is something strangely comforting about living in the presence of this mighty God. Rabbi Harold Kushner gives us this example. The next time you go to the zoo, notice where the lines are longest. We find ourselves irresistibly drawn to the lions, the tigers, the elephants, the gorillas. Why? Because we are strangely reassured that seeing creatures bigger and stronger than ourselves, creatures we did not make and who are not subject to our control. It gives us the message, at once humbling and comforting, that we are not the ultimate power. Our souls are so starved for that sense of awe that encounter with grandeur helps us to remind us of our real place in the universe, that if we can't get it in the church, we will search for it and find it somewhere else. We do not possess ultimate power, and that is good, and we also cannot control God. We can only trust him and be faithful to him as he leads our lives and takes us on a journey that we couldn't have imagined. He has planned for every single one of you. All we have to do is to put our hand in his and let him be in control. He is awesome, all-powerful, compassionate, and loving God. Amen.